Katherine was in and out of consciousness. There were strangers looking at her, a loud siren going. Eventually, she came to in a hospital bed. The stinging in her foot was very dull now, and she was feeling a little stronger. She felt a little dizzy and didn't move much. "I'm still here," she thought. "I'll be fine." Katherine reached down next to the bed and looked through the cupboard. Her phone was in her bag with all her belongings. Nothing was taken. They must have grabbed it when they brought her to the hospital. She contacted her boss by message, letting him know that she wouldn't be in the next day. He responded and wanted a reason for the absence. She knew that this would happen, and she left the reason out for effect. She crafted another message, waiting for the apology. Not too long after that, the message came through. "Get well. Come back when you can. We'll need a doctor's letter." She chuckled a little as she imagined his face contorting when he read the message. The next day, the doctor met with Katherine. She was very concerned with the injury, and it would take a few months to completely heal up. As cuts with broken glass went, this one was pretty clean, and they were able to stitch it together. Katherine would need to walk with crutches for a while. Then after it healed up well enough, she would need a little physiotherapy, and she would be okay after that. They would be keeping her in hospital for a few days, just in case of infection. Later that day, the police came in to see Katherine. They were asking questions, but she couldn't really give them too much information. She remembered running for some reason and then stepping on the glass. She didn't really remember why she was running. She did recall a man staring at her in the alley a night before the incident. The police looked disappointed with the answers. They left shortly after that. He creeped through the hospital. Getting in was easy, but getting spotted was a very real possibility. He had honed his evasion skills over many years, following people. He had to check on his dearest Katherine, see if she was making a recovery. Suddenly, a crash brought him out of his head. Someone had knocked over a large metal container. The nurse station's lights and alarm went off. Someone was asking for assistance. He didn't like that very much. A nurse was sure to come down the corridor to investigate the issue, and then she would walk the same way back to the nurse's station. If it was something more serious, there would be many nurses and doctors swarming the area. He creeped into a room that was dark. The occupants were old and already asleep. He tucked himself in the shadow of the door and waited. The nurse passed him. He heard muffled talking, and then everything was right again. The nurse came back. He could almost feel the footsteps. He needed to get a look at the nurse station's list of patients to get an idea of where Katherine was. This floor seemed to have many older people in it, so he guessed his Katherine was on one of the upper floors. Everything had settled again, and he was sneaking around once more. He reached the middle staircase. It was dimly lit, but he could see fine. His eyes were used to the dim lights of the alleyways he stalked at night. He got up to the second floor and to the nurse station. The nurse was sleeping at her desk. She likely had an alarm to wake her up at a set time to do rounds, and the other nurse was somewhere checking on patients. He spotted the list right by the sleeping nurse, and he leaned in to look at it. She was on this floor, room 204. He grinned. It was just down the hall. Invigorated by the discovery, he was set off to find her. Checking each room, the other nurse was nowhere in sight. She could be in the other wing. He crept closer to room 204. He moved quickly. The lights were dim in here, but not completely out. Someone who was awake could spot him easily. Patients would often do things at night like go out for a smoke or walk around when they believed the nurses wouldn't see them. Room 204, he spotted her. She was in the only occupied bed in the room. Good, he thought. She was asleep, oh Katherine, the perfect prey, he thought. He stepped closer and closer on the balls of his feet, so they made little to no noise. I need to get closer, he thought. He was right over her. She lay there with her brown hair untied, sleeping. He sniffed her softly. She smelt of hospital, and he didn't like it. She was sleeping soundly. He looked over her. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. Was he becoming attached to her? He looked at her again. Rest up, my dear. She started to stir. Katherine was dreaming. She saw something in the alley. A man was running after her. She woke, suddenly gasping. Someone's here in my room. She strained her eyes to see, but could not see anything. The other bed next to her had a curtain that was softly swinging. It could be the air conditioning, she thought. Okay, back to bed, you need rest, she told herself. She lay down again and couldn't shake the feeling that someone was here in the room with her. She closed her eyes and tried to fall back to sleep. That was so close, he thought. She sensed him and awoke. She was so alert. He had just lay flat on the ground right in front of her bed, out of sight. Now he would need to wait. He heard her let out a sigh. Her breathing had slowed down. Time for him to leave. He stood up carefully and took one last glance at her sleeping on the bed. He had left her sleeping there and made his way down the corridor already. He checked the nurse station. The second nurse was there as well. She was facing the corridor. This was going to be tricky. He would have to create a distraction slip past and leave the building. He dipped into the room close to the station and looked for something to throw. A bedpan. Perfect. He tossed it and hid behind the door in the shadow. The shadow was comforting to him. He heard the nurse coming to investigate the issue. She entered the room and saw the bedpan on the other side of the room. Quickly, without a sound, he slipped out and dashed past the station. He went down the stairs to the first floor, retracing his steps. He was home free. Going back out the door that he left ajar, he exited the building and walked off into the night to hunt. Katherine slept soundly after that, with little to no disruption. She had a recurring dream she saw a man standing in a hoodie, but she couldn't make out his face, and he had just vanished into darkness. She awoke the next morning feeling rested, but not fully. It was like she had bad dreams. Okay, time to get out of this boredom, she thought. The nurses were doing their morning rounds, and she casually asked when she could leave. They wanted to keep her there another 3 days till she could discharge herself. She was obscenely bored. She was so used to working long hours, just stopping was so jarring. She decided to watch the TV, but she was bored after a few minutes. She would look up how to deal with a foot injury and healing times online. Maybe she could be up and going even quicker. Katherine wasn't too worried. She always healed quickly. She was an active child and was always playing sports. She loved to compete against other schools and win. She used to get injured all the time on her parents' farm. She loved doing dangerous things, but always bounced back quickly after hurting herself. She knew she would be out of this hospital soon. The next night, when the moon had dipped behind the buildings, the darkness falling across the city, he was on the hunt. He returned to the alley looking for a victim, something to get rid of the hunger that was building up in his body. Whenever he thought of Katherine, he felt the hunger growing stronger. He would need a distraction. Something was wrong with the alley. It felt wrong. The light was very dim, and it was as gloomy as it always was. He couldn't stay here. This was Katherine's alley. He would have to go to one of his older spots. Maybe he would get lucky tonight with a victim. He walked off to a seedier part of town. There were always lost souls walking round. The alley had even less light. It was very easy to blend in, and many people took shortcuts down this way. He found his favorite hiding spot and hid from view. He heard heels hitting the pavement. A woman in a very tight red dress came walking down the alley. He was ready. This one would be a quick one, just like the old ones. He used to kill on the spot, but lately he was stalking a little more because it added more excitement to the end. The woman was scrolling on her phone. She was very distracted. She had walked past his blind and continued down the alley. He slid out onto the badly paved path and started to walk behind the new victim. He bumped one of the trash cans in the alley. The woman didn't even turn around to look. She wasn't like Katherine. Katherine would have turned round or she would have noticed him hiding. Snap out of it, she scolded himself. He had just been standing there doing nothing. She was getting away. This time he was enraged. He kicked a dumpster when he passed it. Nothing, no reaction at all. She wasn't even wearing headphones. He was beginning to feel anger in his belly boiling up like bile. He could taste it in his mouth. The woman continued to walk down the alley. Maybe she wasn't afraid to die and didn't care what happened to her. He was furious. He started running at her loudly, and she still didn't turn around or run. The blade glinted in dim light and cast silver reflections off the walls. It came down with repeated ferocity, and then it was over. He cut himself a little piece for later and placed it in a small bag. A feeling stirred within him, and he could feel the need to consume. He then took a bite as hard as he could, the frustration leaving his body. His teeth slowly punctured the skin, releasing the blood that was beneath it. The red liquid ran down his chin and onto the pavement below. He bit harder and harder, releasing all the pent-up rage. An animistic groan started to leave his body, signaling the kill. All around the alley, his old friends started to come out of the cracks in the walls and the drains. They had remembered the feast that would often follow the violence. They would tell the colony, and then they would all feast on the rich, fresh meat. For them, it was better than the garbage and rot in the sewers. They scurried all over the alley, feasting and then disappearing to the holes and they crawled out of so excitedly. He had his prize and he had fed his old friends. He would wait and watch them pick the bones clean, then he would have to dispose of them properly. He stared and his eyes started to blur. He couldn't focus again. He was thinking of Katherine. She would have noticed him. She would have turned and then run for her life, fought to live. Not just ignored her fate and accepted death, she would probably also fight back and there was a chance she could still get away. The rats had finished cleaning up the body. He collected all her things. The smaller rats would clean the rest of the leftovers up. He placed her clothes in a bag and tossed it into one of the garbage bins. Her phone was unlocked with no password. Great, he thought. He would snoop through all the messages and pictures later, just like he did with the others. He learned so much about people through their lives on their devices. He pushed some of the bones down a broken grate. The bigger ones he would have to dispose of in the sewer. They had a massive cutting device down there. It was used to break up bigger debris flowing down the sewer. It had massive spinning blades that would eat anything you threw into them. He walked towards the manhole, lifted it with a small pipe, climbed down, and proceeded to throw the bones into the cutter. He always loved to watch them disappear. Sadly, this was only a small distraction, and something bigger would be needed to get his mind off Katherine. Katherine woke the next morning still confined to her bed. She had been recovering fast, just as she had thought. She tried to bargain with the nurses for an earlier release, but they refused, saying she would need to talk to the doctor. He refused, and he imagined her at home walking on the foot, ripping the stitches out. Then he would have to re-stitch the wound. She would wait until the days were up. On the final day, she got her antibiotics, crutches, and she was out of there. Katherine grabbed the first taxi she could and headed off home. She felt much better being out of that hospital. It was never good being in one. There were the weird smells, people coughing, the despair. Katherine despised being in there. We hope that scared you a little. Remember to subscribe and check out Creepy Midnight Stories for more.